I speak to you not as a learned man, but as a humble servant who has watched God work in quiet places. I have learned that the Lord does not always protect his greatest treasures with noise or strength. Often, he hides them in silence where only faithful hearts can find them. So it was with the Christians of Japan, whose faith lived not in churches of stone, but in trembling hearts and whispered prayers. When the world turned against them, they did not raise their voices. They bowed their heads. When words became dangerous, silence became sacred. In the darkness of their homes, behind closed doors and careful glances, love for Christ remained alive, breathing softly like a flame sheltered from the wind. Their faith was not proclaimed with banners, but carried in memory, in gestures, in the quiet passing of belief from parent to child. I have stood many years at a door, watching people come and go, learning that God often arrives unnoticed. So too did he remain with these hidden believers. In their restraint, in their fear, in their endurance, God was present, listening to prayers spoken only in the heart. Do not think silence is absence. Silence can be obedience. Silence can be courage. Silence can be love held so tightly that it dares not speak aloud. In such silence, the faith of these souls was preserved, not by power, but by trust. When the priests were taken away, a great silence fell upon the faithful. The shepherds were gone, some driven into exile, others led quietly to death. Families were left alone, like children standing in the night without a guiding hand. I understand this loneliness well. I too knew what it was to lose those who once gave direction and comfort, and to stand before God feeling small, uncertain, and afraid. The Christians of Japan felt a deep spiritual orphanhood. There were no bells to call them to prayer, no sacraments openly given, no voices to teach or correct. And yet, God did not abandon them. When human guidance disappeared, his presence drew nearer, softer, more intimate. In the emptiness left behind, he filled their hearts himself. Mothers became the first teachers of faith. Fathers learned to pray without words. Grandparents guarded memories like sacred relics. I have learned that when all visible supports are removed, God teaches the soul to lean on him alone. This leaning is painful, but it is pure. The faithful did not grow strong because they understood much, but because they trusted deeply. In the absence of priests, God himself became their shepherd. He walked with them in fear, in secrecy, and in longing. And in that quiet dependence, their faith did not die. It matured, hidden, patient, and enduring, waiting for the day when light would return. When the doors of the churches were closed, God opened other doors. Quietly, without sound or sign, the homes of the faithful became sacred places, kitchens where bread was broken, rooms where children slept, corners where lamps burned low, all were transformed into altars known only to God. I have learned that holiness does not depend on grand walls or solemn ceremonies. It dwells wherever love and prayer are faithful. In these homes, voices were lowered and movements were careful. A simple bow of the head replaced public worship. A shared glance carried more meaning than spoken prayer. I imagine these families gathering in the stillness of night, hearts beating quickly, hands folded in reverence, trusting that God saw what the world could not. I spent my life serving at a door, sanctifying small acts through intention alone. So too did these believers sanctify their homes. The floor became holy ground, the table a place of blessing. The silence itself became a hymn rising gently to heaven. God does not abandon his people when buildings fall silent. He enters more deeply into their lives. He listens from the shadows. He receives prayer from trembling lips and faithful hearts. In these hidden churches, formed of love and courage, the faith survived, not loudly, not proudly, but faithfully, dwelling where God has always loved to dwell, within the quiet devotion of his people. When the priests were gone and the churches silent, the care of souls fell gently yet heavily upon parents. Fathers and mothers became shepherds without title or training, guided only by love and fear of God. I watch this with deep tenderness, for I know that true guidance is born not from authority, but from sacrifice. These parents did not teach faith through many words. Words were dangerous. Instead, they taught through example, through the calm of their faces in times of fear, through patience when questions could not be answered aloud. Children learned by watching how their parents bowed their heads, how they treated one another, how they endured hardship without bitterness. I have learned that the soul listens more to what is lived than to what is spoken. A gentle tone, a steady hand, a quiet refusal to betray faith, these formed hearts more deeply than sermons ever could. Each sacrifice made in silence became a lesson written upon the hearts of the young. To guide a soul is a heavy burden, especially when the cost may be death. Yet these parents accepted it with humility. They entrusted their children to God, teaching them not how to survive the world, but how to remain faithful within it. In this hidden shepherding, faith was carried forward, fragile yet strong, passed from heart to heart through love alone. As time passed, the familiar prayers began to fade from memory. Words once spoken clearly were slowly forgotten, altered, or lost altogether. Yet, faith did not disappear with them. The faithful learned that prayer is not held together by perfect language, but by intention of the heart. I have long known that God listens more closely to what is felt than to what is spoken. In the silence of their homes, these Christians prayed without words. A tear became a petition, a bowed head became a confession of trust. A trembling pause before sleep became an offering placed gently into God's hands. They no longer knew every phrase, but they knew whom they loved. I myself have often stood before God with nothing to say, offering Him only my weakness and longing. In those moments I learned that silence can be prayer when it is filled with love. God does not measure devotion by clarity of speech, but by surrender of the soul. These hidden believers trusted that God understood their broken prayers, their forgotten words, their imperfect memory. And He did. Their faith endured because it rested not on form, but on fidelity. In quiet rooms beneath watchful fear, prayers rose without sound, carried by tears, intentions, and a love that no forgetting could erase. Faith did not pass quickly among these families. It moved slowly, carefully, like a small flame carried through strong wind. Parents spoke in fragments, gestures replaced explanations, and rituals were practiced without full understanding, yet with deep reverence. Children learned not by questioning openly, but by observing quietly. I have learned that what is given slowly is often held more firmly. These families protected the meaning of their faith by guarding it with patience. A sign made with the hand, a pause before a meal, a story told softly at night, these became vessels of truth. The children did not always know why these acts mattered, but they felt their weight and carried them forward. In my own life, I learned holiness through repetition and humility, not through sudden understanding. So too did these children grow in faith. Each generation received what it could carry, no more and no less. The flame was never allowed to blaze brightly, for brightness invited danger. Instead, it was kept alive, glowing quietly, warming the heart. Time passed, faces changed, yet the faith endured, not because it was loudly proclaimed, but because it was carefully handed on. In this slow and faithful transmission, God worked patiently, trusting His people to protect what the world sought to extinguish. Fear lived close to these families, like a shadow that never fully left them. Every footstep outside the home caused the heart to pause. Every knock at the door carried the weight of uncertainty. Discovery could come at any hour, quietly, without warning. Daily life was shaped by careful listening, by measured words, by eyes trained to read danger before it spoke. I understand this watchfulness well. I spent many years at a door, opening and closing it countless times, never knowing what face would appear. I learned that the door is a place of humility. One must be attentive, calm, and trusting. These faithful souls lived always at such a threshold, where courage and fear met each other daily. They guarded their faith gently, not with defiance, but with wisdom. Their silence was not weakness, but obedience. When fear grew strong, prayer grew deeper. They learned to place their safety, their children, their very lives into God's hands again and again. I have learned that when danger feels near, the soul learns true trust. These believers woke each morning without certainty, yet they chose faith. They opened their doors with care, but opened their hearts fully to God. And in this constant vigilance, God remained close, standing quietly beside them, unseen, faithful, and steady at every doorstep. To remain alive, the faithful learned to let their faith wear simple clothing. What was sacred could no longer appear sacred to the world. A statue was shaped to resemble something ordinary. A gesture looked like habit. A symbol rested quietly within another form. I have learned that God does not resist humility. He accepts it, and he often chooses it. These believers did not hide their faith out of shame, but out of wisdom. They understood that truth does not lose its power when it lowers itself. Just as Christ took the form of a servant, so did their faith take the form of ordinary things. What the eye could not recognize, the heart still knew. I spent my life performing simple tasks that many would overlook, yet I found that God delights in smallness. In these hidden signs, carved softly into daily life, the faithful preserved what mattered most. A prayer lived inside a routine. A holy memory rested inside a harmless object. God allowed his truth to be carried quietly because love required survival. He did not demand outward signs when they would destroy his people. Instead, he entered their caution, their restraint, their careful wisdom. Thus, faith endured, clothed in simplicity, protected by humility. It waited patiently, not weakened by concealment, but strengthened by devotion that asked for nothing but to remain faithful, even when faith itself had to remain unseen. Time moved slowly for these faithful souls. Years passed, then decades, and still no priests returned. Children grew old, and their children after them, all holding a faith they had never seen openly lived. They did not know if help would come, if their waiting would ever end. Yet they continued, loving God without promise, without recognition, without certainty. I have learned that waiting purifies the soul. When one serves God without reward, without assurance of success, love becomes simple and true. These believers prayed not for relief, but for strength to endure. Their faith was no longer sustained by hope of change, but by fidelity itself. Generations lived and died without seeing the fruit of their endurance. Yet God saw every quiet act, every whispered intention, every faithful passing of belief from one heart to another. The waiting itself became their offering. I spent my life in humble repetition, opening the same door day after day, never knowing what good might come of it. And so did these families wait, repeating the same small acts of devotion, trusting that God's time is not ours. In this long patience, their faith deepened. It was no longer a memory of the past, but a steady presence carried forward through centuries, strong not because it was seen, but because it was never abandoned. At last, the day came when faith could be spoken openly once more. The hidden Christians, whose lives had been spent in careful silence and quiet devotion, stepped forward. They bore no grandeur, no pride, yet their hearts shone with a strength forged through suffering, patience, and unwavering love. I have learned that God's work is never lost. What is refined in quiet endurance emerges more beautiful than before. These souls had endured fear, hunger, and centuries of waiting. They had passed faith from parent to child, hidden in gestures, stories, and whispered prayers. Now, when they could speak, when they could gather, the church discovered not weakness, but a faith deep and resilient, formed in humility and trial. I reflect, as I always have, that true holiness does not need recognition. It does not rely on outward signs or applause. Faith grows strongest when it is unobserved, when it perseveres through danger, when it is offered purely out of love. The hidden believers of Japan had walked in shadow, yet their light could not be extinguished. Through patience, prayer, and quiet courage, they preserved the truth of Christ. And so I tell you, faith formed in suffering is never destroyed. It is only refined, enduring beyond fear, beyond time, and beyond the eyes of men. Its witness is eternal.